Hello and welcome to the Oxford German Classic podcast. My name is Santhia Velasco Kittlaus and I'm a graduate student in the Subfaculty of German here at Oxford. I also coordinate this year's Oxford German Classic essay competition for sixth formers. And I'm really happy to have Professor Carolin Duttlinger with me here today. She is a fellow in German at Wadham College, co-director of the Oxford Kafka Research Centre, and also my supervisor. Thanks for joining me today. Hello.
Yeah, hello. I'm really happy to be here and I'm looking forward to our conversation about Kafka.
Thank you. Before we dive into the conversation about Kafka, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, please? Whereabouts you're from, how long you've been at Oxford, and what your current research is about?
Yeah, of course. So I'm originally from Germany, from the Black Forest specifically. And I did my undergraduate in Germany at the University of Freiburg. And in 1999, I came to the UK to do a master at the University of Cambridge. And the plan was to go back after a year. And here I am, over 20 years later. So I then ended up doing my PhD at Cambridge as well. And after that, I got my current position, which is as tutor in German at Wadham and as professor of German at the university. And I've worked on Kafka on and off for a very long time, basically since I was an undergraduate. Of course, I've done other stuff, but I just find I keep coming back to Kafka because
Why is that?
Well, I don't know. One of the things that I like about Kafka is that he doesn't plan his writing. He doesn't have a sort of clear structure before he starts writing something. It's a very spontaneous thing for him, which is also why so many of his things were unfinished. Yeah. So it's sort of high risk, high gain. In the worst case, you end up with lots of fragments and unfinished books. But in the best case, it just produces texts which are really fascinating and sort of almost dreamlike in their intensity. And so I just find Kafka is never trying to teach us something because he, in a sense, doesn't really know what's going to be the outcome when he starts.
One of my students once told me that they feel like Kafka is very open to quite individual responses. Do you think that is true?
I think it is. It's both a plus and a bit of a problem potentially.
Yeah.
So I think there is a risk that people just project their own interests and maybe sort of bugbears onto Kafka. But I think it's great because it means Kafka speaks to people from different walks of life. So, for instance, I have tried reading his stories to my own children when they were quite young. And of course, they don't understand everything, but these are quite simple, accessible stories. You don't need a lot of historical knowledge to get into them. And you can usually summarize the plot in one or two sentences.
And especially the text we're talking about today, which is the beginning of this novel, Der Verschollene, The Man Who Disappeared by Franz Kafka. We're talking about Der Heizer, or the Stoker, which is the first chapter of this novel. And it's about 17-year-old Karl Rossmann, who is sent to America by his parents on his own. And then he arrives in New York by ship, where he also encounters the ship's stoker. And I think it is really interesting to have chosen this text as Karl Rossmann is at the same age as the people who will actually take part in this competition, which makes it quite interesting. Yeah. But before we talk a little bit more about this chapter, I realized when I started reading it, I have no idea what a stoker is. Can you tell us a little bit about this, please?
Yes, this is quite interesting. So that maybe contradicts what I was just saying, that you need no historical knowledge. I think, of course, you do need a bit of historical knowledge. So just to say, Kafka wrote this novel in 1912, so 2 years before the start of the First World War. So it was a time of great technological innovation, very fast industrial development. And one of the results of this development was steamships, so big ships that crossed the ocean and that made, of course, traffic between, say, Europe and the so-called New World much faster and more efficient. And so a stoker, or Heizer in German, is someone who stokes these massive engines that are in the bowel of these ocean liners, basically. So you have to think of like a massive steam engine that had to be constantly fed coal in order to operate and to drive this huge ship. And so these steam engines in ocean liners were the largest machines that actually existed anywhere in the world at that time. And they required about 40 people to operate them. And it was very hard physical work, as you can imagine, shoveling coal into this huge furnace to produce enough energy really to propel the ship.
Whereas this chapter mentions only one of them.
And it's one of these things, you just don't really think about it because it's just the stoker. Interestingly, and we'll get onto that, the stoker is of course not the protagonist. The stoker is not the boy whose fortunes we will follow over the course of this story. It's an older man whom our protagonist meets in the first chapter, or rather in this story.
And what do you think is interesting about the characters in the Heizer, as there are many of them?
There are quite a few, it's true. So at the center is this relationship between two men. So on the one hand, as you say, 17-year-old Karl Rossmann, who has basically been exiled. He's been sent to America on his own forever as a punishment by his parents. And there's lots to say about that as well. And on the other hand, this older man, this adult man, we don't quite know how old he is, also from Germany or from a German-speaking context. And they basically meet at the beginning. They meet in the stoker's cabin because Karl gets lost on the ship and he just knocks on the door. And so it's partially a story about male friendship, which is, of course, a very old plot line that you find in lots of narratives. If you think of Steinbeck, of Mice and Men, for instance. So it's a sort of, you can describe this as a story about a boy growing up. But then it gets much more complicated. And then, of course, if you've read the story, you know that from this sort of little two-hander between the two male characters, they then emerge from the cabin, go to the captain's office, and then suddenly the office is filled with lots of other people. They meet more people along the way. And most crucially, the relationship between Karl and the stoker, that is basically at the heart of the chapter, is subsequently replaced when Karl meets his uncle Jakob. And so the relationship between Karl and one adult man is replaced by his relationship with another father figure, basically.
Whereas these things, they seem to happen to Karl. This is at least the experience I had in reading it. He doesn't seem to be fully aware of what happens to him in his life.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we could talk about the beginning, for instance, which already introduces us to this theme. So if you've read it, you will know that it starts with the ship arriving in New York Harbor. The first thing that Karl sees of the New World is the Statue of Liberty. It's, of course, a very interesting, iconic moment. So the statue, of course, embodies the American dream. It embodies liberty, all the opportunities for immigrants coming to this country. But Kafka makes a crucial change. So the statue is holding not a torch as the symbol of enlightenment. It's holding a sword as perhaps the symbol of violence, judgment. And the statue is described as a goddess. So the statue is female. So it's very important at the beginning that this statue is female. But I think the main thing for our purposes is that Karl is standing here looking up at this towering female figure. And what he thinks to himself at this point is so hoch, so high, so tall. As the ship is moving forward, he is looking up. But he, of course, is not in control of his movement. He is being moved along by the ship, just as later he will be swept along by the people trying to disembark. And then he is forced to go back because he has forgotten his umbrella and so on. So he is moving constantly, but he is never quite in control of his movements.
And he even gets lost in looking for his umbrella.
Yeah.
He leaves his suitcase behind and gets lost. And on his way of getting lost, he meets the stoker.
That's right. So it's a bit like one of these comedies about chance encounters, you know. It's like a little screwball comedy in a sense. It's quite funny, you know. So here he is with his suitcase about to disembark, and then he thinks, hang on a minute, I've forgotten my umbrella. Kafka 10 years later will be very excited by the films of Charlie Chaplin. It's that sort of humor. It's people bumping into each other, people chasing each other, people playing tricks on each other. So it's quite a sort of farcical story, really.
Interesting that you mentioned Kafka was interested in film, as I got the impression that certain scenes, at least how they are described, how people move, the lines of visions of Karl Rossmann that we read, the kind of mirror movements or images from film.
Yeah. Kafka was a huge fan of the cinema. He spent a lot of his spare cash and spare time in the cinema. And the night he starts writing this text, Der Heizer, he has just come home from the cinema. So he writes in his diary about the films he saw. And by the way, in those days, you didn't go to see a feature film, which lasted 90 minutes. The program was basically made up of a series of shorts. And so he describes in his diary all the different films he sees, including, as he says, a chase where a young woman is pursued by a lecherous priest, and a film featuring some horses. Our protagonist is called Rossmann, which means horseman. So Kafka, in the notebook, describes the cinema visit. He draws a horizontal line, and then he starts his first sentence of the novel.
That is fascinating.
Yeah. And I think this cinematic perspective, movement, the joy of movement, the joy of technology and entertainment, that's absolutely at the center of this book.
We can feel that in how Karl looks. Like we have sometimes, he tries to go on his way and then he looks out of the window and all of a sudden we have half a page of a description what he sees and how he's moved by that.
Yeah.
And then it moves back and it's almost as if a camera would look out of a window, and I find it a bit distracting in reading it, I have to admit. What do you think about that?
Yeah.
How does it mirror Karl's almost immature perception?
It's true. I think he's quite an unreliable and unstable observer. He doesn't always get the full picture. And I think, as you say, precisely, this is Kafka reminding us very subtly that this is not the experience of an adult. This is the experience of a very confused child, basically, who is lost, who is quite literally at sea, and who has to forge new relationships. And absolutely, these passages of description, which, you know, maybe a modern day editor would make Kafka scrap them, too long, not relevant, let's progress with the plot. But it's that sort of lingering gaze. So you've already mentioned him looking out of the window. So at the start, he's on the deck of the ship. He's looking at the Statue of Liberty. It's almost like sort of, you know, you can imagine the camera slowly moving forward and then up. There's also this strange moment where the statue appears to Karl as if in a suddenly stronger sunlight. Here, I think we're almost reminded of a photographic flash, you know. It's like almost the narrative is sort of briefly pausing as he looks up. Then, of course, as you say, he goes back into the bowels of the ship, he meets the stoker, and then they go up again to the captain's office, which has windows. So it's also, you know, it's a bit like Titanic. Does your cabin have a window or not? That tells you about social status. And the ship, by the way, is, of course, a sort of floating microcosm of European society. That's really what it is, with the different decks and the different cabins. But once he's in the captain's office, he, of course, there's a lot of talking. They're having a debate about the stoker and his sort of personal problems. But then suddenly this whole thing pauses and we just get a sort of lingering view of the harbor and the city outside.
You brought a very interesting book with you today.
I did, yeah.
As I think Kafka himself has never been to America, is that right?
That's right. So it's quite an interesting idea, isn't it, to write a whole novel about a place you've never been to. And of course, we know what we would do in that situation. We would research it on the internet. Kafka in his day did other things, but he certainly was quite active in trying to fill his lack of knowledge. So he went to talks with slideshows, and he also bought at least one book, which was by a German journalist called Arthur Hollitscher, who traveled to the United States and wrote a book about it called Amerika heute und morgen, America today and tomorrow. And it's overall a fairly critical account of the New World. So he talks about racism, he talks about capitalism, about exploitation, about class sort of structures, but he also certainly, conveys this European excitement about the New World. And so here we've got a double page from the book where we see basically across 2 photographs the skyline of New York City with the Empire State Building. Also, by the way, the very first image we get in Hollitscher's book is, surprise, the Statue of Liberty. So you can see how closely Kafka tracks this book. He starts with exactly the same shot, and he then proceeds to exactly the same panorama of the city. But what's interesting when we follow Karl's gaze is that he basically looks out of the window twice. The first time he feels really happy and confident, and he feels he has an overview of the city. And the second time when he looks again, when the conversation is not going so well, suddenly he focuses on the bobbing boats and the boys and so on, and he says it's all a bit confusing and overwhelming.
So his perception mirrors his situation in his life, his feelings.
Yeah.
So we follow his inner experience through the visuals that he describes.
Yeah, and that's
in following his
basically,
gaze. Okay.
that's how I would read the whole text. Whatever the text describes, it's never objective, even though, of course, it's a third-person narrative. It doesn't say, I saw, it says he saw, but it's always about people's subjective experience in Kafka. Nothing is ever objectively true. It's always seen through someone's point of view.
There are certain moments in which even the soundscape plays a role. I remember there's the marching musical band of the ship coming, and Karl is in the room of the stoker and is really confused by it. And he doesn't know what is happening.
Yeah.
So in addition to the visuals, there are also sounds that kind of mirror how Karl is led by impressions that he gets from the outside. Yeah. And is constantly overwhelmed by these impressions.
That's a really nice example. So I think it's always worth thinking about the different senses. What does he see? What does he hear? Maybe what does he feel? What does he touch as well? Kafka is a very sensory writer, but that's a really nice example, again, of Karl not being in control.
Yeah, and although he's not at all in control, we get the feeling that he tries to do things right, don't you think?
Yeah, yeah. I think Karl is actually quite a nice guy. And I'm saying this partially because I know about the next 2 novels Kafka will write, The Trial, Der Prozess, and The Castle, Das Schloss. They have grown-up men as protagonists, the famous K's, K. Dot, so which many people, of course, read as a reference to Kafka. But these are both rather manipulative, devious people, I would say, or at least they're much more mixed characters. Karl is no saint, but I think he is fundamentally someone who's trying to do the right thing, as you say. He has a very strong sense of justice. He wants to stand up for his friend, the stoker. And at the end, when his uncle says, come on, it's time to go, say goodbye to him, he is absolutely distraught. He cries and he kisses the stoker's hand. And it's one of the very few moments in Kafka's texts anywhere where we have genuine friendship. Kafka's protagonists very rarely have friends.
Wow. And it also shows us how emotional he is and pure in a very childlike way, although on the threshold to adulthood.
Yeah. And this, of course, is the other amazing thing about this text. What do we find out about Karl? Why has he been sent to America? Because he got the maid pregnant. And this is, of course, part of the genius of the story, that we've got a boy who is lost. We've got a lost child who is also a father at the same time.
And at the beginning, it's described that he was seduced, but later we get the impression that he was actually raped by her.
Yeah, Yes. So one of the techniques Kafka uses is flashback. This is in the conversation when the uncle, who of course was in the background of the room and suddenly steps forward and says, I am your uncle who emigrated to America and is now a millionaire. So it's a sort of fairy tale twist suddenly in the middle of the plot. But this conversation then gets Carl to remember what actually happened. So at the very beginning, we're just told that he seduced the maid and the maid got pregnant. And then in the later scene, we get the full, as it were, memory, again from Carl's point of view, of course.
And quite visual. And it's quite fragmented of how he remembers it.
Yeah, it's well worth having a look at that scene. It's very interesting how sex is described, because it's very clearly the perspective of someone who doesn't know what's happening to him. And someone who is not in control, once again. The maid is almost like the mother. She carries Carl to the bed. She undresses him. So it's a very creepy scene, really. It's quite troubling. It's clearly about sexual abuse. And one of the things the novel does a lot, and we see this in Der Heizer, is that it sort of plays with and subverts gender roles. So in this book, women are often very strong to the point of being violent, and Carl is very often, again, sort of the victim, not always, but very often.
How does the goddess of the Statue of Liberty play into that gender idea?
I think the goddess basically is your first signal that this is going to be about strong women, scary women.
And dangerous to Carl.
Here, of course, you have to throw in, this was a time where women were asking for more rights, including the right to vote. It was a time when gender roles were changing, where sexual rules were becoming more liberal, and a lot of men were not happy about this. So it was a time when there was a lot of controversy around gender roles, what is a real man, what is a real woman. All of these proto-feminists, they are kind of sick. So, you know, people have said that Kafka's text reflects this male unease about strong women. But I think it also satirizes this, you know.
Which makes it quite interesting for us today to come back and read the texts by Kafka, especially the Heizer, through this lens.
Yeah. I mean, I think fundamentally it's both a text that really speaks to us and a text which is very different. And I think it's no good just applying our current, you know, sort of viewpoint. You just have to take it for what it is. And I think sexual relations is one example.
Thank you. That was really fascinating. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks. Those were really interesting questions. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. And for those of you listening or watching us today, have a look at our website or search for Oxford German Classic Prize to find out more about our essay competition for sixth formers. Thank you. But for now, bye and tschüss.